McDermott, and in this video we're going to look at the first two fights, the first two campaigns of the American Civil War, the attack on Fort Sumter and the clash between two amateur armies shortly thereafter at Bull Run. Americans on both sides were shocked at the casualties at Bull Run. Of course, there was much worse to follow. Very few people at that time had any appreciation that the Civil War was going to last for 4 long and extraordinarily destructive and bloody years. The number of Americans who died during the 4 years of the American Civil War often numbered at 600,000. However, more recent numbers that result from some very detailed studies of census figures put the number higher, as many as 750,000. But no matter what the number, it was a national catastrophe, except for the fact that the American Civil War brought an end to slavery in this country. And I suspect that without that kind of violence, it would have been very difficult for Southern slaveholders to agree to emancipation. At any rate, let's look at those first two battles that took place. First, Fort Sumter, Charleston, South Carolina. And of course, that was the direct result of the election of Abraham Lincoln. His train arrived in Washington at 6 o'clock on the morning of Saturday, 23 February, 1861. By then, 7 southern states had already seceded from the Union, and they had seized federal property, and they demanded the surrender of government facilities to include Fort Sumter. The president-elect refused to comment on that emergency until he had taken the oath of office on the east portico of the Capitol. But then he made his position crystal clear while delivering his inaugural address. The president's first words highlighted the key issue and were intended primarily for Southern ears. And he said, "I have no purpose, directly or indirectly, to interfere with the institution of slavery in the states where it exists. I believe I have no lawful right to do so, and I have no inclination to do so." But then his disclaimer was followed by a stern reminder. "I shall take care, as the Constitution itself expressly enjoins upon me, that the laws of the Union be faithfully executed in all states. The power confided in me will be used to hold, occupy, and possess the property and places belonging to the federal government." President Lincoln then stressed how unwise a civil war would be and where blame would rest. And he said, "In your hands, my dissatisfied fellow countrymen, and not in mine, is the momentous issue of civil war. The government will not assail you. You can have no conflict without being yourselves the aggressors. You have no oath registered in heaven to destroy the government, while I shall have the most solemn one to preserve, protect, and defend it." The final paragraph of President Lincoln's inaugural address came directly from his heart. "I am loath to close. We are not enemies, but friends. We must not be enemies. Though passion may have strained, it must not break our bonds of affection. The mystic cords of memory stretching from every battlefield and patriot grave to every living heart and hearthstone all over this broad land will yet swell the chorus of the Union when again touched, as surely they will be by the better angels of our nature." The Confederate Vice President, Alexander Stephens, was equally explicit concerning his views when he wrote, "Our new government," that is the Confederate government, is founded on the opposite idea of the equality of the races. Its cornerstone rests upon the great truth that the Negro is not equal to the white man. This government is the first in the history of the world based upon this great physical and moral truth. Of course, that's simply not true. There had been slave governments for thousands of years, but this was the first government in North America based on a foundation of slavery. Following a flurry of futile negotiations, President Lincoln acted on his inaugural promise and notified Governor Francis Pickens of South Carolina that he intended to provision the isolated garrison occupying Fort Sumter, and his message forced the Confederates to either allow the resupply to take place or to attack and cede the fort. Rebel leaders chose to follow the latter course. Shortly after 4 o'clock in the morning of Friday, the 12th of April, 1861, a 10-inch siege mortar located on nearby James Island fired a shell that exploded with a flash over Fort Sumter. The 47 howitzers and mortars within range then opened a 34-hour bombardment that ended the following afternoon. Captain Abner Doubleday, second in command to Major Robert Anderson, later described the condition in the fort after the rebels began firing red-hot shot that started several fires. And he wrote, "The fires in the fort's barracks were burning out of control. The scene at this time was really terrific. The roaring and crackling of the flames, the dense masses of whirling smoke, the bursting of the enemy's shells, and our own, which were exploding in the burning rooms, the crashing of the shot, the sound of the masonry falling in every direction, made the fort a pandemonium." Finally, a negotiated surrender went into effect and the national colors were lowered. The Civil War, so long threatened, had begun, and the 3 men who died during the attack, 1 Confederate and 2 Federals, all killed by accidental explosions, were the first to lose their lives before the issue was finally concluded 4 years later. Recognized as the first military action of the Civil War, the attack on Fort Sumter resulted in an immediate upsurge of Northern support to subdue the rebellion by force. It was also the act of aggression that President Lincoln wanted before taking action himself. 3 days later, however, on the 15th of April, he called for 75,000 volunteers to serve for 90 days. An indication that everyone at the time thought it would be a relatively short struggle. Many Southerners viewed this expansion of federal forces as an act of aggression, and 4 more states seceded. On 3 May, an additional 42,000 men, in this case 3-year volunteers, were authorized, and in that proclamation the President also increased the United States Army by more than 20,000 soldiers and the Navy by an additional 18,000 sailors. Recognizing the danger to public safety posed by Northern agitators, the President ordered simultaneous raids on every telegraph office under federal control, and all telegrams sent or received over the preceding year were isolated and scrutinized in detail. Individuals suspected of treachery were jailed, and writs of habeas corpus were denied, to include those writs that were issued by the Supreme Court of the United States. 3 months after the attack on Fort Sumter, 64 volunteer regiments of 900 men each were in camps around Washington, being organized, equipped, and trained to take the field when ordered by the Commander-in-Chief. In his 1876 memoir, then Major General Abner Doubleday recalled his experience when the attack on Fort Sumter first opened, and he wrote, "As soon as the outline of our fort could be distinguished, the enemy carried out their program. Almost immediately afterward, a ball from Cummings Point lodged in the magazine wall, and by the sound, seemed to bury itself in the masonry about a foot from my head, a very unpleasant proximity to my right ear. It also woke him up. In aiming the first gun fired during the rebellion, I had no feelings of self-reproach, wrote Doubleday, for I fully believed that the contest was inevitable and was not of our seeking. The United States was called upon not only to defend its sovereignty, but its right to exist as a nation. The only alternative was to submit to a powerful oligarchy who were determined to make freedom forever subordinate to slavery. To me, it was simply a contest as to whether virtue or vice should rule. Major Anderson wrote, "Our Southern brethren have done grievously wrong. They have rebelled and have attacked their father's house and their loyal brothers. They must be punished and brought back, but this necessity breaks my heart." And that ends the attack on Fort Sumter, which of course was evacuated and taken over by rebel troops. Fort Sumter may have been the opening gun, but the battle that took place shortly thereafter between a poorly trained and poorly organized Union Army and an equally poorly trained and poorly organized Confederate Army served to guarantee that the war was on. General Winfield Scott, the aging hero of the War of 1812 and the Mexican War, had been the commanding general of the Army since 1841. With the advent of the Civil War, he advised President Lincoln to blockade southern ports, and he stressed the importance of controlling the Mississippi River. His Anaconda Plan was criticized as excessively passive, although federal strategy eventually began to look very similar to what he had recommended. General Scott was soon replaced, although not before Washington's defenses got the elbow room he demanded, by putting troops on the high ground on the south side of the Potomac River and ensuring Harper's Ferry, farther upstream, was back under federal control. As the size of the Union forces increased, Northern impatience became more vocal, with a growing clamor of "on to Richmond." And President Lincoln could not ignore the upsurge in political pressure that was applied to him. On 8 July, the 35,000 Union soldiers commanded by General Irwin McDowell received orders to break camp and march. They began moving 8 days later. It took them over a week to get out of their camps. An army of 20,000 Confederate soldiers commanded by General P.G.T. Beauregard occupied positions to block them 20 miles south of Washington at Manassas Junction. The rebels were also on a rail line that connected to another Confederate force of 12,000 men in the Shenandoah Valley, commanded by General Joseph Johnson. General McDowell's plan was to overwhelm the Confederate left by a surprise flank attack, and while willing enough, his army was untrained, undisciplined, and simply unable to move with the speed and the precision required. By the time the battle began on the 21st of July, General Johnson's troops were arriving from the valley by train to reinforce General Beauregard, and a strong counterattack caused some Union units to retreat. Their withdrawal sparked a panicked rush to the rear, with many of the troops arriving back in Washington that night. While the Union Army was soundly defeated, the Confederates could not pursue because of their own fatigue, disorganization, and confusion on the battlefield. This battle highlighted many of the problems common to both sides throughout the first year of the Civil War. Units were committed piecemeal, attacks were head-on regardless of the lethal defensive fires that were available, and infantry failed to protect exposed artillery. Tactical intelligence was largely non-existent, and commanders were unable to employ their forces effectively. At the First Battle of Bull Run, known to the Confederates as the First Battle of Manassas, only about 36,000 of the 67,000 troops available to both commanders were actually engaged. The Federals suffered a total of 2,896 casualties, and Confederate losses were 1,982 men killed, wounded, or captured. Shocking at the time, these were not large numbers when compared to future Civil War battlefields. General McDowell's defeat sobered the North, and the South as well, and a growing realization that the war might be longer and bloodier than initially expected caused President Lincoln to call for another 500,000 three-year enlistees. At the same time, President Davis signed a bill authorizing an additional 400,000 men for the Confederate Army. A man named Sullivan Ballou was commissioned a major in the 2nd Rhode Island Volunteers, and a week before the battle, he wrote a letter to his wife, which he left in his trunk to be delivered to her in the event of his death. He was mortally wounded, and he died, and she eventually received the letter. "My dear wife," wrote Major Ballou, "lest I shall not be able to write you again, I feel impelled to write a few lines now, that may fall under your eye when I shall be no more. I have no misgivings about, or lack of confidence in the cause in which I am engaged, and my courage does not halt or falter. But, my dear wife, when I know that with my own joys I lay down nearly all of yours, and replace them in this life with cares and sorrows, that my unbounded love for you, my darling wife and children, should struggle without me." And the letter continues, "Sarah, my love for you is deathless, and yet my love of country comes over me like a strong wind and bears me irresistibly to the battlefield. But Sarah, if the dead can come back to this earth and flit unseen around those they loved, I shall always be near you." Following the battle, Private Allen Kingsbury of Medford, Massachusetts, who had been wounded, wrote his parents from a hospital in Washington, "Virginia is indeed a desolate country. Most of the buildings are built of logs. The logs are hewed on the sides and placed above the other, and the cracks are filled in with mortar or with mud. I never suffered so much from thirst before in my life. When we came to a brook or a spring, the soldiers would break their ranks and run for the water. As we went along, I saw places where the rebels had their camps. Near noon, we came to places where their campfires were still burning. We were hurried forward as fast as we could go, and when we ascended a hill, we could see men in a field about a mile away, and we could see the glittering of their bayonets. We were ordered to a field near some woods and were then ordered into the woods. We did not know what was there, but we soon found out. We had got perhaps 3 rods into the woods. A rod is 16 feet, when a murderous fire was opened on us by the rebels from a masked battery of cannon. Several of our men were wounded and killed. 3 of my comrades fell dead at my side. I saw an officer on the embankment beside the cannon. I brought my rifle to my shoulder and I fired at him. He threw up his arms and fell headlong down the bank. Private Kingsbury remained hospitalized for about 2 months in Washington before rejoining his unit, and he was killed in action the following April during the Peninsular Campaign. Fighting at Bull Run was heavy and at close quarters in several locations. In Confederate Generals Thomas Jackson, who was wounded, and Bernard Lee, who was killed, lost over half their brigades during the 4-hour battle. General B reported the Federals were about to overrun his position. General Jackson's response reflected both his attitude and his battlefield behavior. It's why he was known to his troops as Old Blue Light. he had sparkling blue eyes and an extraordinary temper. Old Blue Light's answer to General B was, "Then, sir, if you're being overrun, give them the bayonet." Such fortitude caused General B to shout to his troops before he was struck down, "Look, there is Jackson, standing like a stone wall." And that closes the opening gun of the American Civil War. If you have any comments, please make them. I look forward to a discussion. And until then, God bless America.